This is Atma Bodha. Today is December 30th, 2022, and the purpose of this video is to reveal some secrets that have really been a challenge to get out there in a non-biased and non-partisan kind of a way. And when you understand this perspective, it will make your understanding be expanded, and it gives you a much better opportunity to receive that liberation of actually becoming enlightened and being an enlightened master. Because when it comes down to it, it's all about equanimity. And the most equanimous of all is going to be this: the absolute truth. And what do we have down here? Down here is you as the individual. So life is all about how the individual relates with the absolute truth. However, there is something in the way. There can be significant obstacles for the individual to experience the absolute, and that is these, which we have here. Okay, we have these are called ideologies. All right, each ideology requires individuals to make up its collective. Each ideology can be competitive with each other, and they all want to become larger and more powerful. And how they do that is by recruiting individuals to join the ideologies. And ideologies can be from the left or from the right. It's not, a political divide so obvious. But basically what you see closest to the absolute, there's going to be like your religions, right? You can have the Christian religion, you can have the Muslim religion, you can have Hinduism. It's like there's so many different religions, like there's so many different paths to walk down, spiritual paths, and each one can give you tastes or glimpses of the absolute truth. In fact, each religion can even form like a baseboard, a kind of a foundation to reaching that. So if you follow the Christian faith diligently, perhaps you could become a saint, a Christian saint, or a Muslim saint, or a Hindu saint, or a Buddhist saint as well. We got to include Buddhism as well in these, and even the Tao, the Taoists have another path. So we got Buddhism, we got Taoism, we got different ways to reach the ultimate. Okay? Also, so at least religions, for all their flaws, they have a pathway to God. They have a pathway to absolute truth. At least they will say, "In God we trust." They at least they would put lip service to the concept of a higher power existing. At least all of these religions have that in common. Now, I would call it beneath, because there's more of a disconnect between the absolute, would be the other ideologies. I mean, there could be LBGTQ is one ideology. Feminism is another ideology. And of course, I've heard it all. Oh, you're not a feminist? You don't believe that women should have equal rights? No, feminism is not about that anymore. Now it's become something else. It's become an entire ideology. Same thing with BLM is like another ideology. There could, there's a lot of ideology on the right. Maybe pro-life can be another ideology, and maybe some other brand of conservatism could be another ideology. So they have it on the left and the right. But the point is this, is that one thing in common with all of these ideologies is that they can absorb you as an individual and make it more difficult for you to experience the absolute truth. And if you want to experience the absolute truth, it's very helpful to prepare your mind. In fact, it's a prerequisite to prepare your mind by removing any limitations as far as belief goes. So any limiting beliefs about yourself and how you fit into things is going to make it more difficult for you to experience complete liberation, which is complete unity with the absolute. So the idea is to navigate through the ideologies or around them and arrive at the absolute truth while being separate from them. It's like be in the world but not of the world. It's like you don't become ideologically possessed. Why is that? Because each of these collectives, they're not enlightened, okay? They have flaws, they have weaknesses, and collectives, groups cannot become enlightened. Christian group, Christianity, they regard heaven as something that happens after you die. Same thing with the Muslim religion, same thing with Buddhism, except it gets more complicated. And Hinduism get more complicated because it talks about the potential of reincarnation and karma, but it's still about the continuance of the soul, in that there is a connection to the absolute. In Buddhism, they would call that the self, right? In Hinduism, they would call that Brahman, okay? Also, I didn't mention the Jewish tradition. That's like another group as well. Jewish tradition, they would call that Yad-He Vad-He. In the Christian tradition, that would be Jesus Christ or Christ the Father or Yeshua, okay? And so each of these groups has a name at least for this so that you can find that divine connection. Unfortunately, many of the modern ideologies that have become popularized these days, like LGBTQ and feminism, BLM, all the different activist groups, is that usually the concept of a deity is not included. There could be some overlap, and that's why we're also seeing with these ideologies, as you can see, there's a border. Some of these ideologies can border over. We have feminism bordering over Muslim, and the people that are in between there, where they got both. Same thing with Christianity and feminism. You can have that, or Christian and BLM. So it's like people have a different hodgepodge, a combination of different ideologies, which they include in their individual sphere as far as how they identify as. But one thing that's common with every ideology is they tend to make the individual small. It's like when you join an ideology, it's like the ideology is what's big, and you are just like a cog in the wheel. You are a part of a bigger structure, you're part of a bigger organization, but in turn, that makes you feel small, and in other words, it creates a need for you to feel powerful, to have that some sort of a relationship, a connection with these individual groups. And that is why you see a lot of individuals, they have an identity, or it's like if somebody attacks LGBTQ, they feel personally offended because that is their identity. They don't see a separation between LGBTQ, where that begins and where they end, if somebody who's completely ideologically possessed. Same thing with feminism. It's like if somebody makes an attack on feminism, they can feel that as a personal attack if they see themselves completely as a feminist. And so this is what you have. This is the overall structure of modern society today, okay? And so I would say it's definitely a hierarchy where you have at the very top the absolute truth. And then underneath the absolute truth, I would call that there is an abyss, okay? In some other traditions, you could say that in between the absolute and everything else, there is an abyss. There's an emptiness, a blackness. Buddhism would call it the emptiness. And you have to cross over this abyss in order to reach the absolute. And some Buddhists, they don't even regard that as possible because they got a different a twist on things. But once you do cross that abyss and you reach absolute truth, then you've reached a place whereby your every second, your every waking moment is of ecstasy, is of euphoria, where you feel your mind is continuously inspired without end. And also you're able to maintain that unconditional love in your heart. And so right now there's a competition on in today's society for your soul, basically. It's like, do you give your heart and soul to this movement? Do you give it to this movement? Do you give it to this movement? And all of these movements in the end are not helping you to achieve your real goal, which is to reach the absolute truth. And you might say, oh, well, how do I know that's really what my real goal is? Well, truth is the ambition of all intelligence. That's the root of all knowledge is truth. Everybody, whether consciously or unconsciously, everybody is going to want to have the truth. They're going to want to experience the truth. And the same thing with love in the heart. So I would say that the mind can have access to the absolute truth directly via the crown chakra, otherwise known as the Sahasrara, otherwise known as the crown of glory in the Christian tradition. And when that crown of glory opens, it's like the heavens above open up to you. But one thing to be perfectly clear is the absolute truth, it exists independently of all the world's religions and the world's ideologies. It's not confined to any of them, right? There is no, the absolute truth from my perspective, it's not a judgmental deity. It's not like, okay, I am high and mighty, I am holier than thou. No, it's more about being holier for thou. And somebody who is become a master and who is living in the continuous experience of the absolute in a continuous state of samadhi, they live to serve every individual. Why do we exist as masters? To serve the individual. It's very simple, because the individual is the smallest, most marginalized group. And I believe Ayn Rand was the first to really get famous with that quote. So the smallest marginalized group is the individual, okay? And so what are the purpose of all these groups then? Well, the most valid a group can be is in how it ranks the importance of the individual in the group, okay? If the group is not valued and the group is valued more than everything else, then you know that you're not in an ideal group, because groups should not exist to protect the group as the first priority. Groups don't need groups for protection, okay? Individuals need protection, not groups. Groups don't need protection. Individuals do. And so if the individual is getting protection from the group, then that would be the best use of a group. And I know it's kind of old-fashioned now, but back in the day of the knights of old, there was a concept of chivalry. And what is chivalry? Chivalry is protecting the weak and the oppressed, okay? And typically that meant protecting especially women and children. And that was not because we didn't regard that women were not powerful or empowered. It's just that women were, physically less strong than a man. A man could overpower a woman, and but also protecting the weak and the oppressed. And so what is oppressed? Oppressed would be people subject to tyranny. And that's the ultimate danger of all of these collectives, is that collectives lead to tyranny, whereas the absolute leads to sovereign individuality, freedom, and liberation. So if you want to be liberated and feel free, you want the absolute truth. You don't want ideologies in the mix. Okay, you want to be free from ideologies. And you might argue, well, Adma, why do you say that what you're talking about right now isn't itself an ideology? Everything that you just described, how is that not an ideology? That brings me back to chivalry, okay? The best use of a group is when the priority of protection is not to protect the group, but to protect the smallest, marginalized group, which is the individual. And as long as you have a group that is dedicated to, number one, protecting the individual and protecting the weak and the oppressed, that type of ideology is not harmful because it's putting the individual first. Only ideologies that put the group first are going to be harmful. And why is that? Because each individual has a potential of being much greater than the sum of its parts. Like each group, you could say, for example, with feminism, you're a woman, okay? The best they can give you is equality or improved potential in the job market and female empowerment, okay? But still, so what does that come down to? Okay, you're empowered now as a female, okay? Well, is female your only identity? I mean, of course, now with the trans movement, it's like what qualifies as female. It's like, it's no longer dependent upon apparently your biological attributes. Apparently, that your physical biology has nothing to do with feminism. So it's how do you see yourself. So do you see yourself as an empowered female? Do you see yourself as a male? Is male now become a bad word? In some ideologies, just being a male or just being a white male can be regarded as a bad thing, So, but ultimately, to get away from partisan politics, an individual is beyond gender, okay? It's beyond male and female. It's like when you recognize the spark of the infinite, the divine within your heart, that is limitless, okay? That's beyond gender. You can have both genders included. It's like, there is no, either or, it's like if you're a enlightened yogi, it's like you're not giving up anything. In fact, there's nothing to give up, because when you already have everything is already included within you. So you get all the benefits of feminism just without even being a part of feminism. You get all the benefits of LGBTQ without dedicating your heart and soul to that movement. Same thing with Black Lives Matter. It's like, why is it Black Lives Matter and praising, the color of your skin is okay as long as if you're, praising black, but that's not very equal, is it? It still has to do with race. And so when you're bringing things down to race, it doesn't matter what side of the fence you're on. When you make it about race, there's a quote Martin Luther King Jr., it's not about the color of your skin, but the content of your character. So whenever you're making things about race, you're literally going against the MLK Jr. And so there's a lot of hypocrisy, unfortunately, with many of these ideologies. And hypocrisy is what in turn leads to tyranny. It's like when you, as an individual, are made to feel small and the group is made to feel big, that's when you can be taken advantage of. That's when it's harder to accept deeper truths of having the spark of limitless absolute Brahman within you, within your heart. Because if your headspace is being filled up with one of these ideologies, there's a part of you that's going to be limited, that's going to not see it possible that mastery is possible, to not see it possible that you can reach a place of limitlessness and samadhi and nirvana. So in conclusion here, I know this looks a bit messy, and over time we'll get better at conveying this very important idea in a shorter way and in a more beautiful way. But the whole idea here is very simple, and that is the individual, the sovereign individual, versus tyranny. It's are you about liberty or are you about tyranny? This is the age-old question that dates back to the founding of the United States. It's always been about liberty versus tyranny. Liberty leads is the root is from the individual, whereas tyranny comes from these different collectives. And you can call collective a different name, but as long as it's a collective and an ideology, it's basically a placeholder for a similar concept of what government used to be back when the founding fathers were struggling to write the Constitution. It's like maybe before tyranny was about an actual king and a dictator and having a kingdom be the tyrant. Now what we're finding is that the source of tyranny and collectivism is these individual ideologies. And it doesn't matter which one, because as long as it's an ideology that's putting the group ahead of the individual, you are promoting something that leads directly to tyranny, because each of these ideologies is about conformity, okay? Conformity. So if you're in an ideology and everybody wants you to think the same, and that you can be canceled if you have a different perspective or a different opinion, you are in a group that requires complete conformity, okay? And so you are in a tyrannical group. If you're in a group that encourages free discussion, encourages freedom of speech, it's not trying to get you to conform to a certain ideology or a way of thinking, then your group has more liberty, because you now have the sovereignty of the individual as being the most important thing, okay? Sovereignty, individual sovereignty. And this is it. And this is the biggest summary of the biggest problems facing humanity today. It all comes down to this. And ultimately, the solution to all of this is to recognize what we just said. Don't put collectivism first. Put individual liberty first, always. Don't put the group as being more important than the individual. Groups don't need protection. Individuals is what needs protection. The only people that can become enlightened are individuals, never groups. You're never going to see a group become enlightened. It just doesn't, it's not how it works. Each individual can become liberated through their own personal relationship with the absolute. And whether you call the absolute a higher power, whether you call it God, Brahman, Yadhe Vadhe, whether you call it the self, whether you call it whatever name you have for it, as long as your goal is to form a more perfect union with a greater truth, that's where you get freedom. And that's how you can have true equanimity of mind, and how your heart can have unconditional love, otherwise known as agape love. And that's a very Christian principle. I know that Jesus Christ taught about how loving thy neighbor as thyself and putting love first. And these Christian values is what helped bring humanity to a better place. And now what we're seeing is a lot of these values are being eroded by these various groups, by these various ideologies, where love before people has now become an unknown emotion, that many people are even confused even what this means. Many people, including myself, when I was younger, I had no idea what love was. It wasn't until I became an adult that I even discovered what is love. And the same thing is true happening all across the world today, and in large part because of the focus on ideologies, which is what's been keeping people from experiencing the absolute. So we're going to cut this short, and maybe we'll explore this topic in more depth in future videos. I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have about this. I'm trying to keep this be as non-political and non-partisan as possible, and keeping truth pure My motive here is only to share the truth and to oppose untruth, to oppose ignorance. And I hope that this is a benefit to any of you watching this. And this is just the beginning. Until next time, Abba Boda, signing off.